Bartholomew Kuma is Vegapunk. This theory proposes that Dr. Vegapunk is not a separate scientist slowly turning Kuma into a cyborg, but that Kuma is the genius scientist experimenting on himself, that the name Vegapunk is merely an alias created to conceal his true identity, and that the story of Bartholomew Kuma is really the story of a man forced to use his high aptitude for science to create monstrosities for the same world government he stood against for nearly all his life, all for the sake of protecting his kingdom's beloved people. But for me to build a better timeline of this character, I first need to establish the timelines of Kuma and Vegapunk individually, not yet working off the idea that they're one and the same. Kuma was born in the Sorbet Kingdom and was also the former king of that kingdom. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was part of the royal bloodline. Lindbergh states that the world government are punishing Kuma because he was the king of an allied, assumedly to the world government, nation. But why would they punish someone for being king unless that king was a usurper? Nearly every possible definition of the word tyrant, Kuma's epithet, includes the idea of a usurper, someone that overthrew the old monarch and took over their position as king. Considering Queen Connie of Sorbet is in Marie-Joie with no one arresting her, the distinction between the former and current queen and the fact that if Kuma took over a non-world government nation, the world government wouldn't care, Sorbet must be a world government country. The world government are at the very least okay with his dethroning, as seen by the fact they won't restore him to his old position, but considering he revolted against the world government by dethroning their king, they were likely the ones who in turn dethroned him. The title of tyrant, then, is another propaganda piece by the world government. It technically denotes the truth in that it refers to him being a usurper, however the imagery it conjures to those who don't know any better implies someone cruel and oppressive, while the reality is that he's kind-hearted, according to those who've truly spent time with him. This lines up with the theme of old kings born into nobility being the bad ones, and the usurper revolutionary kings generally being the good ones. So we now have the elements of a truly good person being born in a country and usurping the king of that country and taking over their position, and ultimately failing due to the overwhelming force of the world government. This story is on a trajectory identical to the other examples of revolutionary takeovers shown in the series, the two major examples of which being Drum and Lelucia. If the story of Sorbet Kingdom already shares so many similarities to these other more fleshed out examples of revolutions, then we can reasonably assume that most of the details of these other stories that haven't been directly confirmed in Sorbet's case have happened in Sorbet's case too. In these examples you also have the old king born of nobility being greedy at the people's expense, the uprising being an organised effort by the people who were fed up with the current king's cruelty, and the man who became king did so because he was the leader of the revolt and already had a good relationship with the people. And if this was also the story in Kuma's case, then this would give him a motive, in that he personally suffered at the hands of his leader's selfishness also. So, to recap. Kuma was born in Sorbet Kingdom and personally suffered, along with many of his fellow countrymen, at the hands of his greedy, selfish and cruel king. At some point the people had enough, and with Kuma as the leader, they organised a revolution, and due to the fact Kuma was liked by the people and was also the leader of the revolt, he was elected king. The Sorbet Kingdom then lost its world government status. Kuma, in allowing for better lives for the people, likely allowed the country to do better for the period he was king. This, along with the simple fact of the revolution itself succeeding, flew against the world government's narrative. This is why the world government branded Kuma as a tyrant. In reality, the old king was tyrannical and Kuma was benevolent, but the world government wouldn't want word to get out that a revolutionary king did better than a world government one, and so simply flipped the story on its head. Now, while the one other example of the world government's response to a recently revolutionary country is to fucking demolish it with an ancient weapon, this was likely a unique case due to Sabo and or the Great Cleansing. The normal response is probably just to send the Marines, and that's what they did with O'Hara, despite how big a threat that was, because the point in both cases is to set an example. Considering Sorbet is still around, the Marines probably just took back the country, where it remains as a world government one, with Connie as its queen. They probably tried to arrest Kuma, but he ultimately escaped, as seen by the fact he was part of the revolutionaries before being under the control of the world government. By the point of Ace's flashback 12 years ago, he was a revolutionary officer aboard their ship. While monarchs have been known to have side hustles in the past in One Piece, surely if Kuma wanted to support the revolutionaries as much as possible, he would remain a revolutionary king, as that way he would have way more power and influence to support their efforts. By pre-time skip, he was no longer an active part of the revolutionaries, and instead now a warlord working for the government, being mechanised by Dr. Vegapunk, and we know the rest from there. Now, before I provide a concrete timeline, I want to explain a few things first, namely about Bonnie. We learned in 1062 that Bonnie is Kuma's daughter, and I believe Connie is the mother. Firstly, I do believe they're two separate people. The Vivricards treat them as separate in their default reading, so do the public, and so do the Marines and World Government, who contain not a single person who's caught on either, as otherwise Connie would be arrested upon setting foot in Marijois. It also doesn't make sense that someone could be the queen of a country and a world-famous pirate at the same time. Despite the fact Bonnie changing her age is consistently shown as enough to fool people, this is probably how she escaped Akainu by the way, it's incredibly convenient that not a single person anywhere has cottoned on to the fact that the queen of a country disappears for large periods and is consistently absent at the same time a world-famous pirate is active, a pirate who looks extremely similar, has an extremely similar name and comes from the same country. A Queen Dowager is a person who's inherited the title from their former husband, i.e. there was once a king of Sorbet Kingdom who then lost the title and passed it to Connie. As Kuma is the only example of a former king in the story so far, it was probably him. Bonnie is Kuma's daughter and looks similar to Connie when aged up, because she is also Connie's daughter. Why are their names so similar? Connie named her child something similar the same way monarchs in real life give their kids similar names, to continue tradition once their spouse inherits the title. The obvious question, then, is why is Connie allowed to rule if she was once married to Kuma? Furthered is this by the fact that she, being a dowager, hasn't since remarried, and due to her position as queen, I doubt it's due to a lack of suitors. Rather, this is likely her own choice, and she doesn't want to marry anyone since Kuma because she had a deep emotional attachment to him and likely supported his actions. It wouldn't make sense if Connie was just a random woman Kuma picked up after becoming king. However, what if Connie was already the wife of the previous corrupt king Kuma overthrew, who then remarried Kuma when he became king? As Oda probably wouldn't want to make Kuma someone who forced a woman to marry and have a child with him, I assume she did so willingly, and so there's probably a story there where the old king, who was also bad to his people, was bad for Connie too, and that when Kuma overthrew him he also rescued her, to which Connie then possibly saw him as a saviour and fell in love with him. Fast forward to the marine ships arriving to arrest Kuma. Connie survived by playing into the idea of World Government King Good, Kuma Bad that the World Government would want to hear. She told the Navy that she once lived a happy life with her loving World Government King, before the evil, violent revolutionary Kuma overthrew them, forced her to be his wife and rule the country like a tyrant, with this in turn being the story the World Government recounted to the rest of the world. Which would not only take the blame off her, allowing her to continue to reign as monarch, as she technically had the right due to being the wife of the former king, but also take the blame off the people, who were most of them also responsible for the revolution. To make Connie seem like less of a backstabber and to give Kuma some agency, maybe this is something they both worked out together. So, timeline. Kuma was born in Sorbet 47 years ago. Kuma and Connie conceived Bonnie January 1st, 24 years ago, assuming the time between Bonnie being conceived and her birth was exactly 9 months. In order to do this, they would have to be together, which wouldn't be possible after Kuma was dethroned by the Marines. Therefore, Kuma was king of Sorbet January 1st, 24 years ago. As the world government wouldn't have just let Kuma rule as a revolutionary for very long, the time of his takeover and the time of his exile likely wouldn't be too far before or after this point. Kuma was a revolutionary officer 12 years ago. Kuma was at least part of the world government and everything that comes with that 7 years ago. We know this because the pacifistas are clones, like judges. Judges' clones take 5 years to grow to full strength, and the pacifistas look fully grown to me. They were fully grown by the pre-time skip 2 years ago. 5 plus 2 equals 7, which means Kuma was working for the world government at the very least 7 years ago, as he would have to give himself to be experimented on to start the process. 2 years ago he lost his mind. Present day, he was a slave for the Celestial Dragons, then was rescued by Sabo and sent back to the Revolutionaries, where he remains to this day. Now, Vegapunk. Vegapunk was born on August the 9th in Karakuri Island. They were extremely gifted in the ways of science since childhood, as everything on that island was created during their childhood. Vegapunk began working on a geothermal plant and cried when he had to go, leaving it unfinished. He personally wouldn't need the geothermal plant anymore, yet still cried, showing he greatly cared for the people. He also, throughout his life, was consistently against pushing ethical boundaries other scientists weren't. All these things show Vegapunk to be a somewhat empathetic and moral person. So what's the source of Vegapunk's intelligence? In my opinion, the important part is the constant hundreds of years into the future motif that surrounds them and their creations. There is only one example in the series I can think of knowing what happens in the future and manifesting that knowledge into the present day to change its outcome, and that is future sight gained through observation haki. Vegapunk has had their ability since childhood, and we have 4 characters in the series who, despite not being fighters, were extremely proficient in observation haki since childhood: Kobe, Aisa, Oitohime, and Charlie. That last one is particularly pertinent as it comes in the arc just before Punk Hazard, where Vegapunk gets a large focus. and the source of Vegapunk's intelligence being seeing hundreds of years into the future to effectively steal stuff from there is suggested by a couple other things. The smiles created by Caesar have to be tested on people to find out if they work. They can't be tested beforehand, that's why the pleasures exist. And just like the others, Vegapunk would only know his smile fruit was a failure by seeing its effect on its user. As its user came several years later, Vegapunk could only have used future sight to see Momo several years ahead. Punko 2, who has Vegapunk's consciousness, says they're mediocre, and yeah, if this is true, they're kind of a fraud. Side tangent, the inventions from the future Vegapunk is copying could be Frankie's eventual creations, hence the multiple similarities between the pair's designs. This would give Frankie a way to actually surpass Vegapunk, as Vegapunk would only be taking snippets from Frankie's wider catalogue. And it would create a classic paradox where Frankie studied from Vegapunk, who in turn studied from Frankie, thereby making the creator of the original designs unknown, which checks out as Oda's favourite movie is Terminator, which revolves around this concept, and whose ideas already cross over onto Vegapunk's storyline. Vegapunk, not wanting to push certain ethical boundaries despite many of his inventions for the world government being weapons to hurt people, the people he associated with in MADS being criminal, and the fact he only started working for the Marines after getting arrested, all suggest that he is being forced to work for the world government. If he was always willing to work for them, he would have just asked them for a job right away, where he would receive the world's best funding and resources, rather than forming an underground organisation. Yonji phrases it as if the world government was always cool with MAD's existence and unexpectedly pulled a U-turn and arrested them once they took an arbitrary step too far. But Yonji wasn't there and would only have heard the story from Judge, who has a way to slant it in the way Yonji tells it, which makes MAD seem more highly reputed when in reality I'm guessing they were always a bunch of criminals that fucked up one day and got caught. So, quick timeline for Vegapunk. Born on Karakuri at some point, Mads at some point later. Arrested by the Marines 24 years ago. Earliest point shown working for the government 7 years ago, which we also know from the Pacifistas, as Vegapunk would also have to be there to begin working on them 5 years before the pre-time skip. Alright, so why is Kuma Vegapunk? Well, let's start with the silhouettes. They're lies. The first one doesn't look like Kuma, obviously, but it's a common framing device in One Piece and anime and manga in general to have a character in the foreground talking about something that is represented by a generic image in the background. Oda has lied at other points in the series with this framing device. This panel in 274 shows a planet of grass that we later find out represents the moon. This panel in 6 something something, I don't know, you'll have to find the panel, shows a pile of treasure that we later find out represents Shirahoshi. Oda has set a precedent in the story for lying with these silhouettes a bit in order to not give away a twist. And this applies to the second silhouette too, though there are examples of inaccurate silhouettes like these such as Kaido, Big Mom and Blackbeard. This silhouette also feels especially like misdirection in that it seems to show someone with a large head like Strawberry or Fukurokujo, wearing a marine cap like Strawberry with bushy eyebrows and round glasses, furthered by Caesar's eyeline. But it's not like the large heads are the reason for Vegapunk's intelligence, as they only make your skulls bigger, and Strawberry and Fukurokujo aren't especially intelligent characters. It's just misdirection like Kizaru, an old man associated with Sentomaru whose power is in all the Pacifistas, who is now shown as a child studying in a snowy climate. Sounds like Vegapunk, right? And yeah, it does. Of course, Oda's going to put some red herrings in there, so that once someone uncovers all the clues suggesting Kuma's really Vegapunk, it's not a complete open and shut case. So let's get into the meat of the theory. First question, what could possibly be so immediately revealing about just the way Vegapunk looks that would warrant Oda holding off on showing him for this long? Let's say Vegapunk is just a guy. Why hold off on revealing what he looks like if it's as meaningful to us now as it was in Thriller Bark? Maybe Vegapunk is of a race that we didn't already know about until now, so the reveal wouldn't have context. But we now know about the Three Eyes and Lunarians, and Oda still seemingly plans to hold off on revealing Vegapunk in the Vegapunk arc. It's possible there's a secret third race, but there's nothing currently in the story to support that other than Big Mom's third missing race, which is probably just ancient giants. The other option is that Vegapunk is a character we've already seen before, which would explain why Oda's holding off on giving an accurate depiction of him, because it's someone we'd already recognise. And as Kuma is the character already the most directly tied to Vegapunk, if anyone, it would be him. How can Kuma and Vegapunk be the same person when one was born in Sorbet on February the 9th, while the other was born on Karakuri on August the 9th? Well, that's because Vegapunk isn't a real person. Caesar Clown is a man who does nearly everything Vegapunk does worse, including concealing their identity. Caesar set up shop on Punk Hazard, an island in the New World that can't be detected via log pose, that is seen by the rest of the world as completely desolate, and where Caesar himself actively employs numerous measures to conceal his existence. In other words, Caesar was as private and secretive as it's essentially possible to go in the One Piece world, and yet it still didn't work, with the Marines as well as multiple Yonko factions constantly out to get him, with one ultimately succeeding, resulting in his entire base and life's work being destroyed. This is Oda showing that being as private and secretive as it's possible to go doesn't really work when the whole world knows who you are and is out to get you, and so it makes sense that Vegapunk, Caesar's more successful parallel, has successfully concealed his identity, by not only using an alias but putting out the idea that the alias is a different person altogether. That way, anyone looking to capture the famed scientist Dr. Vegapunk searches for someone they assume, like Caesar, is being kept hidden away somewhere. Meanwhile, the real Dr. Vegapunk is wide out in the open, staring them right in the face. Let me ask you another question. Why is Kuma even a warlord? Considering there's no evidence of him seriously ever being a pirate other than a line or two from some goobers in Thriller Bark, who also assume that he was cruel and that he wasn't a king, both of which are false. Kuma works directly for the Marines anyway, so might as well just be one himself, and he really just takes up a spot for another potential warlord to do their thing. The purpose of making Kuma a warlord over just a Marine is to make him a public figure. As one of the 7 warlords, one of the 3 powers, nearly everyone, be they criminal or ordinary citizen, will have heard the name Bartholomew Kuma. By creating this idea of a separate scientist buried by the world government, it draws the attention of the kinds of powerful people shown to want scientists like these away from the real scientist who they overlook, assuming it can never be someone so public, and instead have them searching for this imaginary figure they will never find. It's genius, and exactly the opposite of what Caesar did. Everyone knew Caesar as the underground genius scientist that you want working for you, and they all fought to get his attention, and when they didn't succeed, they came after him, and they were able to find him because they knew what they were looking for. Vegapunk is an infinitely more reputable scientist, and yet doesn't seem to have this problem. Wonder why? Now, the people of Karakuri who knew Vegapunk since he was a child call him Vegapunk. It's what's written on everything he made there, and the people who worked with him in Mads also call him Vegapunk. So Vegapunk was likely just the alias he was already using, and the world government just ran with what was already there. Now, the idea of a warlord who is involved in the creation of fake devil fruits who goes by an alias used by those involved with his scientific work in order to conceal their identity is an idea that's already been done once before, in Doflamingo and his alias Joker. In fact, Doflamingo and Kuma are even both introduced in the same panel. Doflamingo comes first, and so it's his secret identity that is exposed first, right at the start of the New World in Vegapunk's old lab. Kuma comes second, and so it's his secret identity that is exposed later, at the very end of the New World in Vegapunk's current lab. Doflamingo and Kuma even both have the same backstory of once being royalty who were then deposed by the world government after disagreeing with their corrupt nature. The warlord who produces failed smile fruits and the warlord who produces successful ones. If we're going with the idea that Vegapunk is a creation meant to draw attention away from Kuma, then these details start to make sense, particularly the birthdays. Notice how Kuma's and Vegapunk's birthdays are exactly 6 months apart. They literally could not be further apart in the year from each other. If we assume that the world government is trying to use this idea of Vegapunk to draw people's attention away from Kuma as much as possible, then it makes sense that they would give Vegapunk a birthday completely opposite from Kuma's, as if to say, look guys, they're such different people that their birthdays are literally on opposite ends of the year. There's no way they could be the same person, right? As for Vegapunk being born in Karakuri, he wasn't. He was born in Sorbet. This is where I'm going to bring up Child Kuma and how it explains everything. We see Child Kuma reading a book called Ninokin, a reference to the 19th century Japanese agricultural expert and philosopher Ninomiya Sontoku, who is typically displayed as a boy reading a book and carrying firewood on his back, just as Kuma is here. So Kuma is clearly meant to embody Ninomiya as well. To summarize, Ninomiya was born to a poor peasant family in Sagami province, and as a boy Ninomiya's parents both died. He then went to live with his uncle, where he spent his days working on his uncle's land. Popular stories say that at the time, Ninomiya was reading and studying every moment he could. He soon went on to get his own land, and eventually, by the age of 20, he had restored this land by himself. And in his 20s he achieved considerable wealth primarily through his achievements in agriculture. Shortly after, the daimyo, upon hearing of his achievement, recruited Ninomiya to be the ruler of Sagami province, the place he was originally born. From there he acted as a benevolent ruler who, when faced with a similar famine, tried his hardest to give the people the grain the other nobles were hoarding, only to be met with refusal. You can already see how many of the elements here are extremely similar to those found in the timeline of Kuma I've already theorized on, namely Kuma being born into extreme poverty and later working his way into becoming the ruler of that area in his 20s. Kuma would be 23 at the time, despite his low origins. You have the element of a bunch of nobles hoarding a bunch of resources at the extreme deficit of their citizens, something that comes up time and time again in One Piece, as well as Ninomiya/Kuma being an outlier in terms of being a ruler that actually wants to help the people. The interesting thing here is obviously the bit in between Kuma's birth and his becoming king, which you'll remember was a big 20-year blank spot in my original timeline. The important thing is that everything in Ninokin's timeline in between the 2 points it matches up with Kuma, i.e. everything in between Kuma's birth and his revolutionary takeover, sounds exactly like the story of Vegapunk. Ninokin and Vegapunk were both children in a certain place who were studying every moment they could, who used their advanced knowledge of a scientific field to renovate the land of that place for the sake of the people. However, they ultimately left this place unfinished when they decided to move to their own land, where they also used their advanced knowledge of science to renovate that area, only this time succeeding, doing so by their 20s. And after they had reaped enough wealth/power from their respective fields of genius, they returned to the place they were originally born to become the ruler, despite being of common birth. Bearing all that in mind, here is the final timeline for Kuma. Kuma, shortly after being born into poverty and sorbet, suffered through famine caused by his ruler's greed. This famine claimed the lives of both his parents, and so, following this, Ninomiya moved to a different region to live with his uncle, that place in Kuma's case being a different island altogether, Karakuri, with his uncle possibly being the Professor Tsumiki, the old man from Karakuri who created the automatas. From there he was always studying, and slowly transformed the land around him using his advanced knowledge of agriculture, or, in Kuma's case, science, to help the lives of the people there. Unfortunately, he was ultimately unable to finish fully repairing that place as he soon moved on to his own land, Egghead Island, and by the age of 20 he had fully restored this land, i.e. built his lab and founded MADS. By the time of his 20s, he was wealthy enough from his agriculture, i.e. powerful enough from his science, that he was able to go back to his original place of birth and become king. Even the detail of Ninomiya losing his parents and himself suffering through a famine, only to later become ruler of that region and try to prevent a similar famine, is reflected in Jewelry Bonnie, his daughter, often seen eating a large amount of food, as Kuma knew from first-hand experience how bad it was as a child to go through that, and so made sure that his child never had to suffer the same fate. The second thing I want to point out is how the timelines of Kuma and Vegapunk line up extremely well throughout. When did the Marines come to arrest Kuma? 24 years ago. When did the Marines come in to arrest Vegapunk? 24 years ago. Now, Yonji says that the Marines simply came in and arrested Kuma, and he's been working for them ever since. But we already know Yonji's story is a bit wrong, as he wasn't there at the time. He only knows about this stuff from Judge, and Judge has a reason to slant the story in the way Yonji tells it. He says that the world government were always cool with MADS and suddenly pulled a U-turn and went after them when they took an arbitrary step too far, when the reality is that MADS were always a bunch of criminals in hiding and the world government always wanted to arrest them. One day MADS fucked up and they were able to do so. Likewise, saying Vegapunk was the only guy of the originals to get arrested when the rest of them managed to escape, despite the fact Vegapunk outclasses them in nearly everything else, so he should be the least likely, is just a way of making Judge look better, as Vegapunk always outclassed him scientifically. And the lie makes sense because Vegapunk is indeed working for the Marines now. The problem is that there's nothing to actually suggest that Vegapunk was even working for the Marines during the next roughly 2 decades after MADS was busted. Think about everything Vegapunk has created or discovered during his time with the world government. Sea Prism Stone underlining ships, the Devil Fruit objects, the Pacifistas and Seraphims, Kuma's modifications, all of them, a recent invention from the past few years. Sea Prism Stone underlining ships, a recent thing. The Kuma Pacifistas began creation when Kuma became a warlord 7 years ago. Kuma's modifications, the same thing. The Seraphims, hella recent. The Devil Fruit objects, recent discovery. Even the one not created by Vegapunk was 3 years ago, after Caesar was working with Vegapunk again for the first time in a while, and so probably learned how to do it from him. And the earliest Vegapunk is actually shown working for the Marines is on the Punk Hazard flashback, which was only 4 years ago. So there's a giant period where there's no sign of Vegapunk actually working for the Marines despite supposedly being arrested 24 years ago, just like how there's no sign of Kuma actually being in Marine captivity despite assumedly being arrested 24 years ago. The earliest point we know Kuma was working for the Marines is 7 years ago, and the earliest point we know Vegapunk was working for the Marines is 7 years ago. We know both these things due to the existence of the Kuma Pacifistas. Only from this point of 7 years ago are there consistent signs of both characters working for the Marines. Let me repeat that again. Both characters were busted by the Marines for their anti-world government operations 24 years ago. Both characters evaded the Marines and both showed no sign of working for them for exactly 17 years, during which both of them were essentially on the run for evading arrest. Then, the earliest point both of them were known to work for the world government was 7 years ago, where they both seem like they were forced to do it, in Kuma's case because he's a revolutionary. After 17 years of trying to find two high-level criminals, they happened to find them both in the same year. And since then, they've both been working consistently for the world government ever since. Does that not strike you as extremely coincidental? The final thing I want to ask is this: why are the world government even doing what they're doing to Kuma specifically? There have been plenty of revolutionary kings in the past 24 years since Kuma took over Sorbet, yet only Kuma has this done to him. This suggests that his being a revolutionary king, despite what Sabo says, isn't the reason for his mechanization and loss of memory, as if it were, this would be done to all of them. It can't be the fact that he was a revolutionary officer, as so was Sabo, and they just killed him. And there's nothing in the manga to actually suggest other options, such as Sorbet Kingdom being particularly important, or that they're just pissed he got away from them for so long. Both of these are possible, but there's currently no reason to think any of these things over any other. I think that in order to find out specifically why they're doing this to Kuma, we have to look at what they're actually doing to him. They're making him a cyborg, sure, but the actual punishment is that they're removing his mind. Implying then that there's something Kuma knows over any other character in the series that makes the world government need to remove his memory. This could be something to do with the Sorbet Kingdom, as Akainu has a line saying he was extremely worried when he heard Bonnie escape the Marines. By the way, I don't know when this happened, but it was probably when she was just a pirate, because, pirates get captured by the Marines all the time. It's probably not significant. So, what could this be? Well, I'll get to that in just a second. Because we finally get to 2 years ago, where Kuma has lost his mind. Now, the biggest problem with this theory for a long time was the question of 1. Why would the world government erase the mind of their scientific genius? But also 2. How would they do it, considering that since the pre-time skip, Vegapunk has actively been making scientific advancements for them? And that would be a great question if you were asking it before the Egghead Island arc, where we're introduced to the 6 satellites, artificially built people who originally had no mind or will of their own, who have been inserted with the mind of Vegapunk. And this explains how Vegapunk's scientific output could continue after Kuma's mind was removed. So we have Bartholomew Kuma, a character already heavily associated with Vegapunk, has had their mind removed, something of which we've seen no other example of in the series, and now we have an artificially grown person who started off with no mind or will of their own, having had the mind of Vegapunk inserted into them, and we only see this character after Kuma has had his mind removed. And while we're on the topic of 1062, Cypherpol were tasked with killing the 6 satellites, something which even Lucci points out seems like an odd decision from the world government. And what just so happens to be their other goal, replace them with a clone of Kuma. Not only that, a Seraphim clone. The Seraphim seem to be set apart by the fact they can use Haki, as clearly displayed by the Mihawk Seraphim in their introductory chapter. And remember that the source of Vegapunk's intelligence is his observation Haki. This is why they decided to do this now. They finally have a clone of Vegapunk who is completely loyal to the world government, but who can also equally recreate their scientific output, and who doesn't have the interpersonal conflicting of interests the satellites do. In fact, the reason the Kuma Pacifista is described as a problem child over any of the others, after repeated lines about not being able to fully suppress the innate will within something, is because Haki is one's willpower, and if Vegapunk has such a strong observation Haki that he can see 500 years into the future, this is why the Kuma Pacifista has a stronger willpower than any of the others, and thus is less able to be controlled. And this, by the way, is why I think the world government are removing Kuma's mind over anybody else, because he's Vegapunk. He's the man that knows how to build something that no diffed an entire Yonka crew, with that not even being one of his most impressive creations. And this power is in the hands of someone who was once a top tier in the organisation, whose sole goal is to take down the world government. Of course they would want to get his intelligence into a mindless slate as quickly as possible, and do away with the original man. And this is further suggested by the fact that it's Kuma's helping of Luffy's crew, who is in turn Dragon's son, and this being the actual reason Kuma helped them, that was what caused the world government to fast forward the plans in removing Kuma's memory, once it was clear that despite the many years of servitude to the world government, he still secretly planned to take them down. The reason, then, that they're so scared of Bonnie getting free is that they assume she's the one person who can expose the lie that Vegapunk and Kuma are two different people, as she knew Kuma personally when he was king of Sorbet. But from evidence I explained earlier, I don't think she is aware that they're the same. She is going after Vegapunk to give him a piece of her mind, after all. So, what are the world government holding over Kuma's head to get him to do this, or at least agree to this in the first place? It can't be Bonnie, as they're trying to capture her too. It could be Queen Connie, but I think more broadly it's the Sorbet Kingdom itself. The world government has the ability to destroy an island through various means, and yet the Sorbet Kingdom is allowed a seat at the reverie, so they're clearly on good terms. Kuma, being the kind-hearted soul he is allowing the world government to put him through all this torture and use his scientific ability for the sake of Sorbet, including Queen Connie. How did Vegapunk transfer his consciousness to Punko 2? The same way that he feeds objects devil fruits. We know from Minas Lobby that devil fruits contain within them an essence. When the fruit is eaten, this power transfers from the fruit to the person, giving them the power. Therefore, it's likely that Vegapunk is extracting this essence from the fruit and placing it into the object of his choosing. But how does Vegapunk do this? Well, by using the pawpaw fruit. Remember when Kuma used his fruit to extract the pain and suffering from everyone and insert it all into Zoro? Is this not what Vegapunk does when he feeds objects devil fruits, extracting a vague and intangible essence from one thing and placing it into another? As to how Caesar therefore created Smiley after Vegapunk left, he probably just used his own method. All I'm saying is that this is how Vegapunk does it, and even then it seems to be a lot easier for Vegapunk than it does for Caesar. Vegapunk has created multiple devil fruit objects and is giving them away to whoever as though they're not valuable to him. Meanwhile, Caesar has created one, and it makes sense considering Caesar probably had to invent some advanced contraption to do it, while Kuma's fruit allows him to do it with no effort. I've always thought that this power that Kuma displayed in the Nothing Happened moment was completely discordant with all his other powers that involve him sending things at light speed, but this liberty with the fruit could be retroactively justified if this is actually a showcase of how Vegapunk imbues objects with devil fruit powers, and also transferred his consciousness. How about the fact that there are only two other characters in the series who are confirmed to know how to make cyborgs, Frankie and Queen, and the only examples of humans Frankie or Queen have made into cyborgs are themselves. So what does it say about Vegapunk that his only example of a human cyborg is Kuma, considering the pacifistas are built humans and therefore don't count? And this checks out, as how did Vegapunk survive the explosion on Punk Hazard? The same way Frankie survived an extraordinarily similar explosion of a science lab in Karakuri, because he himself is also a cyborg. This panel in 485 was, until the most recent chapter, the first and really only good look at Vegapunk we ever had for nearly 600 chapters. This was the image everyone used when talking about Vegapunk, and Kuma's massive face takes up nearly half of it. But just look at the framing as well. In the background we see Vegapunk's entire body apart from his head, meanwhile in the foreground we see just Kuma's head, almost to imply that Kuma's head should go in place of Vegapunk's. But let's not stop there. While this may simply be a depiction of a generic scientist figure, I can't help but notice the prominence of the gloves and how it seems Oda is making the point that big gloves are a key feature of a typical scientist. And in 1062, Vegapunk's gloves are outright confirmed to be a major feature of his character and scientific process. And notice how Kuma's black gloves are also a key set piece with his character, otherwise exclusive to Vegapunk. In fact, many of Kuma's abilities of his pawpaw fruit we've seen so far involve sending things at light speed, showing to some degree a control over or ability to manipulate light, as is integral to so many of Vegapunk's creations, and hence why the satellites need them, because Kuma, the original, would be able to do what those gloves allow one to do anyway, using his power. How come Sentomaru is explicitly Vegapunk's bodyguard, yet he is never actually seen guarding Vegapunk and is instead always guarding Kuma and his lookalike pacifistas? In fact, the panel where he's introduced as Vegapunk's bodyguard, he's seen guarding a massive Kuma-looking pacifista. The imagery speaks for itself. If Kuma is Vegapunk, then every other member of Mads represents a core aspect of him. Caesar makes smile fruits, Queen turns himself into a cyborg, and Judge both makes clones using his own DNA and is also a fallen king. In fact, all of the Mads members represent royalty in some way. Caesar Clown can just as equally be translated as Caesar Crown, Queen is Queen, and Judge is literally royalty. Kuma, as a former king, would fit right in. In this page, in chapter 592, we see a man on Karakuri saying that Vegapunk burst into tears when he had to leave, as we see a panel of Frankie posing like Kuma before bursting into tears. Kuma carries a Bible. This is interesting as devil fruit, something Vegapunk is confirmed to be an expert on, share a lot of biblical connections, particularly regarding the story of Adam and Eve, and how man's first sin came from being persuaded by the devil to eat a forbidden fruit that would give him otherworldly power. The point being, why is Kuma, supposedly the dummy test subject, interested in the Bible, if the Bible is essentially the scientific handbook for devil fruits? How about the fact that every island associated with Vegapunk has been a winter island, Karakuri, Punk Hazard, Egghead, etc., and well, the only thing we know about Sorbet Kingdom is its name, sorbet, a type of ice cream. Hell, even the geothermal plant on both Karakuri and Egghead looks like a giant ice cream. This is further hinted towards by the fact that Kuma is a bear. He is referred to as such in the manga, he has bear ears, and Kuma literally means bear in Japanese. There are only 3 other examples of bears in the stories, the hiking bears, Beppo, and this Sea King. Beppo and the Sea King are both polar bears, and the only non-polar ones, the hiking bears, come from a winter island. Every other time bears appear in the series, they're linked with winter climates, so it makes sense that the most prominent bear, Kuma, does also. I'd also like to point out that as a child, Kuma wore shoes that were created primarily to be able to walk over snow. And speaking of Karakuri, why does General Frankie, the form created from Vegapunk's notes, have Kuma's face, despite the fact that these notes were supposedly created long before Vegapunk ever started working with the world government / Kuma? And there's just a lot of little things that line up if Kuma being Vegapunk is true. Vegapunk giving Kuma one last bit of free will to protect the Sunny despite previously doing nothing but torture him, Kuma giving himself one last bit of free will to protect the Sunny despite the world government's orders. Why is Kuma used as the default prototype for all human weapons despite Vegapunk having the DNA of much more powerful people as well, such as King and Mihawk? Sure, he's physically big, but it's not like that means much in One Piece. It can't just be to use him as an example because of the police Kuma in 1063, which no one's meant to see. Could it be because Kuma is Vegapunk and using himself as a test is just easier? Why are all the satellites young girls? Maybe Kuma is trying to remind himself of his daughter, Bonnie, before he was forcefully separated from her. How come Bonnie visited Vegapunk's lab as a child? It could only imply that Kuma already had a connection to Vegapunk long before joining up with the world government, which goes against the narrative the story has set up repeatedly up until this point. Instead, could Kuma be showing Bonnie around this lab when she was a child because it's his lab and he's allowed in there and is able to give a tour because he owns the place? As to why Bonnie therefore doesn't know Kuma as Vegapunk, Kuma since childhood has been conscious about keeping his 2 identities separate, and if Kuma was going to protect anyone from the knowledge that he was a highly revered scientist in the criminal world, it would be his own daughter. A concern that isn't unwarranted considering Bonnie would later be captured multiple times by the Marines, likely with the intention of questioning her about Vegapunk. Kuma not giving her this information is a way to protect her. She calls Vegapunk a he, sure, but so does everyone else. In this panel in 1062, the only Sea King with an abbreviation of the word Vegapunk is the one with the bear ears like Kuma. Sure, Kuma is described as an old man, but so is Marco, who is 2 years younger than him. Kuma, while he was still king, is shown with glasses, hinting that he was an academic or scholar of some kind. In fact, the only other character I can think of off the top of my head with normal glasses is Tashigi, who is an expert on swords, which he learned from a book, just like Vegapunk is an expert on devil fruits, which he learned from a book. But the thing that first got me to think of this theory, and the thing that actually convinced me once I remembered it, is the SBS of chapter 467, in volume 48, in which Oda reveals that a certain scholar who knows all about devil fruits will explain them soon. The only person who can be said to be a scholar and an expert on devil fruits is Vegapunk. Now, the soon is arbitrary, but considering we're now roughly 15 years past this point, I think it's fair to say that that window has passed. Here's the thing though, Oda never actually lies with the SBSs. Whenever there's a question that would be too revealing to answer, he just avoids it or gives one of those answers. Meaning that the only option is that Vegapunk did truly show up soon after this point, but that we just didn't notice. Kuma shows up 5 chapters later. Not only that, but the SBSs are written once the full volume is done, and the final chapter of volume 48 was chapter 470. Oda wrote this SBS when 470 was the most recent chapter. Oda also likes to say 3 to 4 chapters ahead of schedule, meaning that by the time this SBS was actually published, Oda had already written the part where the scholar who knows about devil fruits appeared in the story, hence his confidence in saying he appears soon. In fact, Kuma being Vegapunk would give a lot more weight to the scene where Frankie meets Kuma, as after studying from Kuma's research for 2 years, at the end of it he finally gets to briefly meet the man himself, being the first person he shows off his cybernetic enhancements to, showing that Kuma's will has been successfully passed on, and that Kuma's scientific research was not wholly a bad thing for the world. As a member of the crew he sacrificed the last bit of his free will to protect, ultimately took his scientific research and used it to help his effort in eventually destroying the world government, the organisation that he has worked for nearly his whole life to oppose, and that now stands as the final wall between him and his people's true freedom. So where do I see the story going from here? Firstly, I think that Bonnie will, in this arc, give us all of Kuma's backstory relating to Sorbet, not revealing that he's Vegapunk as she doesn't know. This will be prompted by the Straw Hats escaping the Pacifista, hiding somewhere and demanding Bonnie will give them an explanation, seeing as she nearly got them killed for her emotions. At the same time, Vegapunk Shaka will explain Vegapunk's entire history, again not revealing that he is Kuma. The justification in Shaka's case will be that the satellites have only been given the parts of Kuma's mind that relate to his scientific genius, as otherwise what would be the point of making the satellites at all? It will be revealed to Bonnie that the satellites aren't really at fault, as they are essentially robots with no choice, and also weren't the ones who actually experimented on Kuma and removed his mind, seeing as they were all only created after Vegapunk's mind was removed. The original Vegapunk is still someone she needs to track down, and he isn't on the island, so she'll get a Vivre card to him, naturally. The arc ends with Bonnie saying goodbye and sailing off to find the original Vegapunk. I then think that the reveal that Kuma and Vegapunk are the same person will be revealed to us when it's revealed to Bonnie, which will happen post-next arc, which in my opinion is Elbaf. Bonnie is someone who likes Kuma, dislikes Vegapunk for what they did to Kuma, is seeking out Vegapunk's true identity, but who doesn't realise they're the same person. In other words, she's the audience surrogate. The reveal can only happen once, so Oda might as well use it on Bonnie, the person who would be the most easily affected out of any character, and whose character can't be completed without her finding out. I think it will happen post-Elbaf so that the backstories of Kuma and Vegapunk have time to gestate in the minds of the viewers, so that we aren't overloaded with information and so that speculation can be allowed to occur with all the new information we've already been given. Now, if Kuma is Vegapunk, the reveal would probably need to happen while Kuma is actually there in the scene, for cinematic reasons. Kuma is currently stationed at Kamabaka with no sign of going anywhere, so the reveal will happen with Bonnie and Kuma both being together on Kamabaka. I say a Vivre card so that Bonnie actually has a direct route to Vegapunk, and it makes sense that it only happens one arc later, rather than her just coincidentally stumbling across the island Vegapunk is. It would also be a cool moment if, just before the full reveal, Bonnie pulls out her Vivre card of Vegapunk and sees it pointing directly at Kuma. But how will the reveal happen? It's unlikely to be through Kuma himself, as he's currently brain-dead, and I think, considering we're on Kamabaka, Dragon will be the one to reveal it to Bonnie and ourselves. In Chapter 593, Ivankov asks Dragon basically all the questions we still have about Kuma, showing she's basically as up to speed as we are. Dragon then responds with the ... implying he knows something more, a secret about Kuma that we still didn't know by that point, that explains all the questions we and Ivankov were asking. The one main thing we've learned about Kuma since then is that he was a king, and I doubt this is the reveal as it doesn't inherently explain all the questions we and Ivankov are asking, and also wouldn't be new information to us the audience if Dragon were to quote, reveal it. Could the secret instead be that Kuma is Vegapunk? It would make sense considering I've already theorised that the reveal will happen with Bonnie and Kuma on Kamabaka. I then think Bonnie will be able to turn Kuma back using her fruit. In Chapter 507, she uses her devil fruit to turn some Marines into kids, and the Marines not only act like kids, but one of them has the line, "Where am I?" indicating that his memory has been lost too. Essentially, it seems she's literally able to change people back to the past versions of themselves. The Marine who asks where he is doesn't know, because when he was 8 he probably wasn't in this exact spot of the Sabaudi archipelago, working as a Marine. He's been changed back in time. This is possibly even why Bonnie ate the fruit to begin with. He'll reappear in the final war alongside the revolutionaries, now having been restored, although pretending not to be so he can sneak into Marijwa. I ultimately think Kuma's character arc will climax in him using the Seraphims to destroy Marijwa. This would tie up so many things. Firstly, what's the ultimate justification for making Vegapunk a character that gets this much focus? Well, destroying Marijwa would certainly be a good one. It makes sense that the creations of Vegapunk, particularly the Seraphims, who the world government have exploited Vegapunk for, and who they have used to destroy many countries with, will ultimately play a big part in their undoing. And as the Seraphims seem to be the pinnacle of Vegapunk's destructive creations, it makes sense that they would be the creation used. The Seraphims are introduced by being used to destroy a nation, and the world government's own nation is essentially Marijwa. Kuma also has personal beef against the Celestial Dragons, as they used him as a slave. His first scene was even in Marijwa, and this, I'm assuming, would be his last. It would resolve the conflict he probably has that his creations were only used for evil, by ultimately performing a good act using specifically the creations that were the worst offenders. And it would resolve his long-time opposition to the world government. Remember how Vegapunk by his youth was already distrustful of the world government, seeing as he formed MADS instead of joining them? Kuma as a young boy on Sorbet likely understood that his corrupt king was only in power because of the larger force of the world government keeping him there, thus making his conflict with them lifelong. I'm not planning for this to be a one-off thing by any means. I know every YouTuber says this, but I honestly hope you enjoyed the video. It turns out a lot more time goes into these things than the duration of the video, so there'll be plenty more from me in the future, so stay tuned. Try to spread the word. I am really passionate about this idea, even if I probably come off as a crackhead to everyone else. Leave a like, all that, stay tuned. More of this to come. Alright. We're asking, and also wouldn't be a reveal to us the audience if Dragon were to quote reveal it. That fucking paragraph sucks. It's just misdirection like Kizaru. It's just misdirection like Kizaru. This is even possible. This is possible even why Bonnie ate the... Oh, fuck you, man. Fucking need to fucking proofread these. This is possibly even... This is possibly...